The dust swirled around the weathered boots of Elijah Hart as he stood outside the general store, clutching a crumpled letter in his calloused hand. The folks of Red Hollow had already begun their whispers, their eyes following him with that mixture of pity and amusement that small towns reserved for their oddest spectacles. A mail-order bride, of all the fool notions a man could entertain. Elijah Hart, the lonesome cowboy who'd barely spoken 10 words since his brother Samuel was gunned down by outlaws 6 months prior, had gone and ordered himself a wife from back east. Reckon she'll take one look at that sorry excuse for a ranch and hop right back on that train. Jake Morrison chuckled from his perch outside the saloon, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "If she even shows up," added Bill Turner, the blacksmith. "Probably just after his money, though Lord knows Hart ain't got much to speak of." Elijah ignored them, his gray eyes fixed on the horizon where the railroad tracks disappeared into the shimmering heat. The letter in his hand, the last one from Miss Clara Monroe of Philadelphia, had been brief but proper. She'd agreed to his proposal, would arrive on the 3 o'clock train today, and hoped they might build a respectable life together. That was all. No flowery words, no promises of love, just practical arrangements between two strangers seeking something different from what life had dealt them. The train whistle echoed across the valley, black smoke billowing against the endless blue sky. Elijah straightened his best shirt, still dusty despite his efforts, and walked toward the platform. Behind him, half the town had gathered to witness what they considered the most entertaining event since the last hanging. When the train groaned to a stop, passengers began disembarking. Rough men heading to the mines, families seeking new fortunes, traveling salesmen with their cases of promises, and then, standing at the top of the steps in a modest gray traveling dress, was a woman who could only be Clara Monroe. She wasn't what Elijah had expected, though he couldn't rightly say what he had expected. Clara was neither plain nor beautiful in the conventional sense. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style, her posture straight despite the long journey. But it was her smile that caught him off guard, gentle, almost serene. Yet somehow it didn't quite reach her eyes. Those eyes, deep brown and watchful, seemed to carry shadows that had nothing to do with the desert sun. "Mr. Hart?" Her voice was soft, cultured, with that Eastern accent that immediately marked her as an outsider. "Yes, ma'am, Miss Monroe." She descended the steps with practiced grace, a single carpet bag in her hand. No trunk, no boxes of belongings. Just one bag, as if she'd left in a hurry or had nothing worth bringing. "Please, call me Clara." That smile again, polite but guarded. The crowd behind them buzzed with speculation. Elijah could feel their stares burning into his back as he reached for her bag. Their fingers brushed briefly, and he noticed how cold her hand was despite the scorching afternoon heat. "Wagons this way," he said, gesturing toward his humble conveyance. It wasn't much, weathered wood and patched canvas, but it was sturdy and clean. As they drove away from town, the vastness of the western landscape opened before them. Red earth stretched endlessly, broken only by scattered mesquite and towering rock formations that looked like ancient sentinels. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and crimson, and dust devils danced across the barren plain. Clara sat beside him on the bench, her back rigid, hands folded precisely in her lap. She hadn't spoken since they'd left the station, but Elijah caught her studying the landscape with an intensity that seemed unusual for a city woman seeing the frontier for the first time. "It's different from Philadelphia, I imagine," he ventured, trying to ease the awkward silence. "Yes," she said simply, then added, "but I find it honest. The desert doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is." It was an odd thing to say, Elijah thought. He glanced at her profile, noting the determined set of her jaw, the way she seemed to brace herself against some invisible wind. "The ranch ain't much," he felt compelled to warn her. "Just a small house, some cattle, enough land to make a living if the weather cooperates. Nothing fancy like you might be used to." Clara turned to him then, and for the first time, her smile seemed genuine. "Mr. Hart, Elijah, I didn't come here seeking fancy. I came seeking—" She paused, seeming to search for the right word. "A chance to be useful. To work with my hands. To build something." "You ever done ranch work?" "No," she admitted. "But I'm not afraid of learning. I'm not afraid of hard work." There was something in the way she said it, a fierceness beneath the gentle exterior, that made Elijah believe her. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the wagon wheels creaking in rhythm with the horse's steady gait. "Why?" The question escaped before he could stop it. "Why would a lady like you answer an advertisement from a stranger? You could have your pick of suitors back east." Clara's hands tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap. "Perhaps I could have," she said carefully. "But I prefer to look forward, not back. We all have our reasons for starting over, don't we?" Elijah thought of Samuel, of the empty chair at his table, of the silence that had settled over the ranch like a shroud. "I suppose we do." As they crested a small rise, the ranch came into view. Elijah tensed, seeing it through her eyes. The modest wooden house with its sagging porch, the barn that needed painting, the corral where a few horses stood listlessly in the heat. It wasn't much, certainly nothing to impress a woman from the city. But Clara straightened beside him, leaning forward slightly. "It's perfect," she said quietly. "Perfect?" He couldn't hide his surprise. "It's real. It's honest work. Honest living." She turned to him, and this time her smile reached her eyes, though they still held those shadows. "May I ask you something, Elijah?" He nodded. "What made you decide to advertise for a bride? A man like you, strong, capable. Surely there were local women who might have—" "There were," he said gruffly. "But after Samuel died, I needed someone who didn't know me before. Someone who wouldn't look at me and see what I'd lost. Someone who might see what could be, not what was." Clara nodded slowly, as if his words resonated with something deep inside her. "I understand," she said. "Sometimes the only way to move forward is to find someone who doesn't know your yesterdays." They pulled up to the house as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Elijah helped her down from the wagon, again noticing the coolness of her touch, the way she moved with careful precision, as if she'd trained herself to take up as little space as possible. Inside, the house was sparse but clean. Elijah had scrubbed every surface, arranged and rearranged the few pieces of furniture, trying to make it welcoming. Clara moved through the room slowly, running her fingers along the rough-hewn table, examining the cast-iron stove, peering out the windows at the vast expanse beyond. "I've set up the bedroom for you," Elijah said awkwardly. "I'll sleep in the barn until we're properly married, if you still want to. That is, after you've had time to settle in. See if this life suits you." Clara turned from the window, backlit by the dying light. "That's very considerate of you." She moved to her carpet bag, opening it with practiced efficiency. "I should start supper. You must be hungry after the drive." "You don't have to. I want to," she interrupted gently. "Please, let me do this." Elijah watched in fascination as she moved about the kitchen with surprising familiarity, as if she'd been cooking on a wood stove all her life. She found the supplies he'd laid in, the salted pork and beans, the cornmeal and precious flour. Her movements were economical, purposeful, and soon the small house filled with the aroma of cooking food. They ate by lamplight, the desert wind whistling through the gaps in the walls. Clara asked practical questions about the ranch, how many head of cattle, where the water sources were, what crops might grow in such unforgiving soil. She listened intently to his answers, occasionally nodding or asking for clarification. "You know," Elijah said, pushing his empty plate away, "most women would be asking about the nearest church socials or when they might get to town for shopping." "I'm not most women," Clara replied simply. "I came here to be your partner. Elijah. That means understanding the work, not just the social niceties." After supper, she insisted on cleaning up, moving about the kitchen with that same quiet efficiency. Elijah sat by the fire, pretending to mend a bridle but really watching her, trying to reconcile this competent, contained woman with the image he'd built in his mind of an Eastern lady requiring coddling and comfort. When she finally sat across from him, the firelight played across her features, softening the careful control she maintained. For a moment, she looked younger, more vulnerable. Then she straightened, and the mask was back in place. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me this chance, for not asking too many questions." "Everyone deserves a fresh start," Elijah replied, thinking again of Samuel, of chances lost and roads not taken. Clara stared into the fire, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Yes," she murmured, "a fresh start." But the way she said it, with that enigmatic smile playing at her lips, made Elijah wonder what exactly she was starting fresh from. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, carrying with it the lonesome howl of a coyote. Clara didn't flinch, didn't show any of the fear he might have expected from a city woman on her first night in the wilderness. Instead, she seemed to draw the isolation around her like a comfortable blanket. "I should retire," she said finally, rising with that practiced grace. "Tomorrow, you can show me the ranch properly. Teach me what I need to know." Elijah stood as well, suddenly aware of how small the house was, how close they stood. "Of course, whatever you need." She paused at the doorway to the bedroom, turning back to him. In the dim light, with shadows playing across her face, she looked like a woman with secrets, a woman running from something or towards something. He couldn't tell which. "Good night, Elijah. Thank you for—" She paused, seeming to search for words. "For not being what I expected." Before he could ask what she meant, she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. Elijah stood alone by the dying fire, wondering what kind of woman he'd brought into his life, what mysteries lurked behind that serene smile and those watchful eyes. Outside, the desert night closed in, vast and unforgiving. Somewhere in the darkness, predators hunted their prey, and the wind whispered secrets across the barren land. And in a small ranch house on the edge of nowhere, two strangers began their cautious dance around the truth, each hiding their wounds, each hoping for something they couldn't quite name. Elijah finally made his way to the barn, settling into the hay with his bedroll. Through the cracks in the wall, he could see the house, a small square of light in the window where Clara must be preparing for bed. He wondered what she was thinking, this woman who'd traveled so far to marry a stranger, who moved through his house like she'd been running all her life and had finally found a place to stop. Tomorrow would bring questions from the town, work to be done, the awkward navigation of two lives trying to merge into one. But tonight, there was just the wind and the stars and the mystery of Clara Monroe, who smiled like she knew secrets and looked at the desert like she'd found her salvation. The morning sun crept across the desert floor, painting the red earth in shades of amber and gold. Clara was already up when Elijah emerged from the barn, hay still clinging to his clothes. She stood by the chicken coop he'd hastily built last week, scattering feed with practiced movements that seemed too familiar for a city woman's first morning on a ranch. "You're up early," he observed, stretching the stiffness from his back. The rooster seemed insistent. She replied with that gentle smile, "I've made coffee." Inside, the kitchen smelled of fresh brew and something else. Biscuits. Real biscuits. Golden and perfect. Nothing like the hardtack he'd been subsisting on since Samuel died. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked, unable to hide his appreciation as he bit into one. "A woman picks up skills when necessary," Clara said evasively, pouring coffee into thick ceramic mugs. "Now, show me what needs doing. I'm here to work, not to be treated like a guest." Over the following weeks, Clara proved as good as her word. She took to ranch life with a determination that both impressed and puzzled Elijah. Her hands, which he'd expected to blister and complain, developed calluses without complaint. She learned to milk the ornery cow, mend fences, and even help with the branding when old Pete Simmons came by to lend a hand. But it was the way she handled the unexpected that truly caught Elijah's attention. When a rattlesnake appeared near the hen house, She dispatched it with a shovel without even calling for help. When thunderstorms sent the horses into a panic, she was in the corral before he was, speaking in low, soothing tones that calmed the beasts, the people of Red Hollow. However, were less easily soothed. "That woman ain't natural," Mary Patterson declared at the general store, loud enough for Elijah to hear as he loaded supplies. "Too quiet, too watchful, like she's waiting for something. Or hiding from something," added Sarah Turner. "Mark my words, there's more to that Eastern lady than meets the eye. No woman of good standing would answer a mail-order bride advertisement unless she had no other choice." Elijah gritted his teeth, but said nothing. He'd learned long ago that defending someone in a small town only fueled more gossip. Besides, he couldn't entirely disagree. There was something Clara wasn't telling him. He saw it in the way she sometimes froze at unexpected sounds, the way she always positioned herself with her back to a wall and a clear view of the door. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the stranger arrived. Elijah was in the north pasture, checking on a sick calf, when he saw the dust cloud approaching the house. A lone rider, dressed too fine for these parts, with a black suit that spoke of Eastern money and a bearing that suggested authority. By the time Elijah reached the house, the man was already talking to Clara on the porch. She stood very still, that serene mask firmly in place. But Elijah could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand gripped the porch post. "Can I help you?" Elijah asked. Positioning himself slightly in front of Clara, the stranger touched his hat brim. "Name's Robert Pinkerton. I'm making inquiries about a woman, dark hair, refined manners, approximately this lady's age. She might be going by a different name." "Lots of women fit that description," Elijah said evenly. "What's your business with this woman?" "That's between her and the law," Pinkerton replied, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. "But I'd be obliged if I could ask your wife a few questions. The lady's not feeling well." Elijah said firmly, "Perhaps you should move along." Pinkerton smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. My apologies for the intrusion. I'll be staying at the hotel in town for a few days. Should anyone remember anything useful," he touched his hat again. "Good day to you both." They watched him ride away, neither speaking until the dust settled. Clara's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the door. "Clara, I need to start supper," she said, disappearing inside. That evening, she was quieter than usual, moving about the kitchen like a ghost. Elijah wanted to ask, wanted to demand answers, but something in her fragility stopped him. Instead, they ate in silence, the weight of unspoken questions heavy between them. It was 3 days later when Elijah proposed the hunting trip. He needed to clear his head, and they could use the meat. To his surprise, Clara asked to come along. "You ever handled a rifle?" he asked. "I'd like to learn." She replied, that careful control back in place. He showed her how to load the Winchester, how to sight along the barrel, how to squeeze rather than pull the trigger. She listened attentively, nodding at his instructions. When he handed her the rifle for practice, she hefted it with an awkwardness that seemed genuine. "Like this?" she asked, struggling with the positioning. "Here." He moved behind her, adjusting her stance. "Steady against your shoulder. That's it." They spotted a buck near the creek, magnificent in the morning light. Elijah expected to take the shot himself, but Clara raised the rifle with a sudden fluid grace. The awkwardness vanished. Her breathing steadied, her hands sure and experienced. The shot was perfect. The buck dropped instantly. Elijah stared at her. She lowered the rifle slowly, that mask cracking for just a moment to show something raw and resigned underneath. "My father," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. He thought all his children should know how to protect themselves, even the daughters. It was the first real piece of her past she'd offered, and Elijah knew better than to push for more. They dressed the deer together, working in companionable silence. But the knowledge sat between them. Clara Monroe knew how to shoot, and shoot well. That night, after the venison was smoked and stored, they sat before the fire. The desert wind howled outside, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Clara stared into the flames, her usual composure cracked enough to show the woman underneath. "I did lose everything," she said suddenly. "Because of a man. That much was true." Elijah waited, knowing that pushing would send her back behind her walls. He promised marriage, respectability, love. She laughed, but it was bitter. "I believed him. I gave up everything for him. My reputation, my family's trust, my—" She paused, swallowing hard. "When I discovered what kind of man he really was, it was too late. The damage was done. We all make mistakes in trusting," Elijah offered carefully. She turned to him then, firelight dancing in her dark eyes. "Do we? Did you make a mistake trusting me, Elijah? A stranger who appeared on your doorstep with nothing but promises?" "I don't know," he answered honestly. "Did I?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Clara rose abruptly, moving toward her room, but at the doorway she paused. "That man, Pinkerton, he'll be back. Are you wanted by the law?" She considered the question. "It's complicated. Most things worth knowing are—" She studied him for a long moment. "You're a good man. Elijah Hart, better than I deserve." Before he could respond, she was gone. But that night, he didn't go to the barn. He sat up in the main room, rifle across his lap, watching the desert through the window. If trouble was coming for Clara Monroe, or whatever her real name was, it would have to go through him first. The next morning brought a tension that even the bright sunshine couldn't dispel. Clara went about her chores with mechanical precision, but Elijah caught her glancing toward the horizon, watching for dust clouds that might signal approaching riders. At midday, Pete Simmons stopped by with news from town. "That Pinkerton fellow's been asking questions about every woman who's arrived in the last year. Showed a photograph around, but it was old and unclear. Mary Patterson swears it could be half the women in 3 counties. "What did the photograph show?" Clara asked, too casually. Pete shrugged. "Dark-haired woman in a fancy dress. Could be anyone, really, but he seems mighty determined." After Pete left, Clara stood at the window for a long time, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. Elijah wanted to comfort her, but he didn't know how to bridge the distance she maintained. That night, the desert seemed alive with possibility. Every coyote howl made Clara tense. Every shift of wind against the house drew her attention. Elijah found himself watching her as much as watching for danger, torn between protectiveness and suspicion. "You could leave," he said finally. "Take one of the horses. Head south to Mexico. I wouldn't stop you." Clara turned from the window, something flickering across her face. Surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. "Is that what you want? For me to leave?" "I want the truth," he said. "But failing that, I want you safe." She crossed to where he sat, kneeling beside his chair with a grace that made his breath catch. In the lamplight, she looked younger, more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. "The truth," she murmured. "The truth is that I've been running so long I forgot what it felt like to stop, to have someone offer kindness without expecting payment." Her hand covered his where it rested on the chair arm. "I don't want to bring trouble to your door. Elijah, you've lost enough. Maybe that's not your choice to make," he said gruffly, turning his hand to grasp hers. "Maybe I'm tired of losing things. Maybe I'd rather fight for something, even if I don't fully understand what I'm fighting for." Her eyes filled with tears she wouldn't let fall. "You don't know what you're saying. You don't know what I've done." "Then tell me." She pulled away, rising to pace before the fireplace. "Not yet, not tonight. Let me have a few more days of this, of being Clara Monroe, ranch wife, before I have to be her again." Elijah wanted to press, but something in her voice stopped him. Whatever secrets she carried, they were heavy enough to bow her shoulders, to put lines around her eyes that didn't belong on a woman her age. "All right," he said. "But Clara, whatever's coming, we face it together. That's what partners do." She stopped pacing, looking at him with wonder. "Partners," she repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose we are." The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows with unusual force. Somewhere in the darkness, a horse whinnied nervously. Clara and Elijah exchanged glances, both suddenly alert. "Could be nothing," he said, but he was already reaching for the rifle. "Could be," she agreed. But her hand went to the kitchen drawer where she'd taken to keeping a sharp knife. They waited, tense and ready, as the night pressed in around their small sanctuary. Whatever storm was coming, whether from nature or from Clara's past, they would weather it as they had everything else these past weeks. Together, even if they didn't fully trust, even if secrets still lay between them like uncharted territory. The desert kept its secrets that night, offering only wind and darkness. But both Elijah and Clara knew it was merely a reprieve. Pinkerton was out there, asking questions. The past Clara fled was closing in. And soon, very soon, the truth would demand its reckoning. The morning Clara disappeared, Elijah woke to an empty house and a cold stove. It wasn't like her. In the weeks since her arrival, she'd never failed to have coffee ready before dawn. He found her tracks leading toward the woods at the eastern edge of the property, the same direction she sometimes walked when she thought he wasn't watching, following the trail through the scrub brush and juniper. Elijah moved quietly, some instinct warning him to approach with caution. The early morning light filtered through the branches, casting long shadows that danced with each breath of wind. Then he saw her. Clara knelt in a small clearing, her hands working at the earth with desperate efficiency. Beside her lay a small cloth bundle, weathered and stained. She was burying it deep, her movements careful and deliberate, like someone performing a ritual they'd done before. A twig snapped under Elijah's boot. Clara spun around, her hand going to the pistol he hadn't known she carried. For a moment, they faced each other across the clearing, both frozen in surprise. Then recognition dawned in her eyes, and the gun lowered. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked quietly. "Long enough." She looked down at the partially filled hole, then back at him. "I suppose you want an explanation. Only if you want to give one." Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Always the gentleman, even when you find your wife burying secrets in the woods like some kind of criminal." "Are you a criminal?" She considered the question, absently brushing dirt from her hands. "I suppose that depends on who you ask." Elijah moved closer, noting how she didn't retreat but didn't welcome his approach either. The bundle in the hole was wrapped in oilcloth, protecting whatever lay inside from the elements. "Old memories," Clara said, following his gaze. "Things that should stay buried. But you kept them, brought them all this way. Some chains are harder to break than others." She stood, dusting off her skirts with mechanical movements. "We should get back. You'll want breakfast." "Clara, please, Elijah." "Not now. Not yet." They walked back in silence, but the secret hung between them heavier than before. At the house. Clara went through her morning routine as if nothing had happened, but Elijah noticed the tremor in her hands as she poured coffee, the way her eyes kept darting to the window. It was midday when Pinkerton returned. This time, he wasn't alone. Sheriff Tom Bradley rode beside him, his weathered face apologetic as they approached the house. "Elijah," the sheriff called out. "Need to have a word with your missus." Clara emerged from the house before Elijah could respond. She'd changed into her best dress, the gray traveling outfit she'd worn the day she arrived. Her hair was pinned up properly, and she carried herself with a dignity that reminded Elijah she'd once moved in very different circles. "Sheriff Bradley," she acknowledged. "Mr. Pinkerton, I've been expecting you." Pinkerton dismounted, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "Then you know why we're here. Miss Monroe, or should I say, Miss Evelyn Morrison?" The name hit Clara, Evelyn, like a physical blow. Her composure cracked for just a moment before she pulled it back together. "I haven't used that name in a very long time," she said carefully. "No, I imagine not. Not since you killed Theodore Worthington in New York City 5 years ago." Elijah felt the words like a punch to the gut. Killed The Clara he knew, who handled his dishes with such care, who sang softly to calm the horses. A killer? That's a lie, Clara said, her voice steady despite the pallor of her face. Is it? Pinkerton produced a photograph, old and creased. This is you, isn't it? Taken at the Worthington Christmas ball, 3 months before Theodore's death. You were engaged to him, I believe. Clara's eyes closed briefly. Yes, we were engaged. And then you put a knife in his chest. That's enough. Elijah stepped forward. You can't come here making accusations without proof. Sheriff Bradley shifted uncomfortably. Elijah, son, there's a warrant. From New York. Murder charges. It wasn't murder, Clara said quietly. It was self-defense. That's for a court to decide. Pinkerton said, Will you come quietly, Miss Morrison? Or do we need to use restraints? She's not going anywhere, Elijah said firmly. Elijah, don't. Clara touched his arm gently. This isn't your fight. The hell it isn't. You're my wife. In name only, she reminded him sadly. We both know that. Ma'am, Sheriff Bradley intervened. If you'll just come with us, we can sort this out proper. Send word to New York. See what's what. Clara looked between the three men, then out at the desert she'd come to love. May I have a moment to gather a few things? 5 minutes. Pinkerton allowed. The sheriff and I will be right here. Inside the house, Clara moved with the same efficient grace she always displayed. She folded a single change of clothes into her carpet bag, the same one she'd arrived with. Elijah followed her, desperate to understand. Tell me what happened, he urged. Let me help. She paused in her packing, turning to face him. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked truly fragile. Theodore Worthington was charming, wealthy, everything a girl from a struggling family could hope for. Her voice was distant, like she was reciting someone else's story. He courted me properly, won my father's approval, promised me the world. It wasn't until after our engagement was announced that I learned what he truly was. What was he? A monster wearing a gentleman's clothes, her hands clenched on the bag's handles. He had appetites, dark ones. I discovered what he'd done to other women, servants, mostly, who couldn't fight back, and my sister Lucy, she tried to warn me. Said he'd cornered her at a party, said things. I didn't believe her. Elijah felt sick. What happened to Lucy? She died. The words were flat, emotionless. They said she fell down the stairs at the Worthington mansion while delivering a message. But I saw her body. Elijah, those weren't injuries from a fall. So you confronted him? I went to his study that night. I was going to break the engagement, expose him, ruin him the way he'd ruined others. But Theodore, he didn't take rejection well. She unconsciously touched her throat. He attacked me, said no one would believe me, that he owned the police, the judges, said he'd do to me what he'd done to Lucy, only slower. The knife was on his desk. I didn't mean, I was just trying to get away, but he came at me again and She shuddered. There was so much blood. His family, they have power, influence. They made sure the story told was of a gold-digging woman who killed for money. No one wanted to hear about what he'd done, about Lucy, about the others. Why didn't you stay and fight? Tell the truth. Clara laughed bitterly. Fight the Worthington family? With what? I had no money, no proof, and Theodore's brother made it clear that if I didn't disappear, my remaining family would suffer accidents too. So I ran, changed my name, kept running until I found your advertisement and thought maybe I'd run far enough. Outside, Pinkerton called out a warning about time. I have to go, Clara said, picking up her bag. No. Elijah took the bag from her hands, set it aside. We're going to fight this. We can't fight the Worthingtons. They're too powerful, Then we'll find another way. But you're not facing this alone. He gripped her shoulders gently. Partners, remember? That's what we agreed to be. Tears finally spilled down her cheeks. I don't deserve. That's not your decision to make, he said firmly. Now, Let's go talk to Tom Bradley. He's a fair man. We'll make him understand. They emerged together, Elijah's hand protective on Clara's back. Sheriff Bradley looked relieved to see them both. Tom, Elijah said, we need to talk about what really happened in New York. Save it for the judge. Pinkerton interrupted. I'm taking her back east on the evening train. Now hold on, Sheriff Bradley said. The lady has a right to tell her side. She can tell it to a New York jury, or she can tell it to a territorial judge first. Elijah suggested. Tom, you know Judge Matheson in Tucson. He could hear the case, decide if there's cause for extradition. Pinkerton's face darkened. The warrant is clear. The warrant is from New York, Sheriff Bradley said thoughtfully. This is Arizona territory. We do things different out here. If Elijah's willing to vouch for her, post bond. I don't see why she can't have a hearing with Judge Matheson first. This is highly irregular, Pinkerton protested. Maybe, but it's fair. The sheriff turned to Clara. Ma'am, if I have your word, you won't run. And Elijah here posts bond. I'll arrange for a hearing. You can tell your story to someone who doesn't have a dog in the fight. Clara looked at Elijah, hope warring with fear in her eyes. You'd risk your ranch? Everything you've built? It's just land and cattle, he said. You're worth more than that. She broke down then, the careful control finally shattering completely. Elijah pulled her against him, feeling her shake with suppressed sobs while Pinkerton fumed and Sheriff Bradley pretended to study the horizon. All right, Clara whispered finally. All right, I'll stay. I'll fight. That's my girl, Elijah murmured, surprising himself with the possessiveness in his voice. The sheriff cleared his throat. Well then, Mr. Pinkerton, looks like you'll be staying in Red Hollow a bit longer. I'll send word to Judge Matheson today. Court'll probably convene within the week. Pinkerton looked like he'd swallowed something sour. This is a mistake, Sheriff. The Worthington family won't be pleased. The Worthington family isn't here, Sheriff Bradley replied mildly. And out here, we care more about justice than pleasing rich folks from back east. After the lawmen left, Clara and Elijah stood in the dusty yard, the weight of revelation settling around them like twilight. That bundle, Elijah said eventually. The one you were burying, what was in it? Clara hesitated, then seemed to decide there were no more secrets worth keeping. Letters, from Lucy, about what Theodore did to her, and the bloody dress I wore that night. I couldn't throw them away, but I couldn't bear to look at them either. We'll dig them up, use them as evidence. After 5 years, water-stained and buried, it's something. And out here, sometimes something is enough. That night, for the first time since her arrival, Clara wept openly. She sat by the fire and let the tears come, grieving for her sister, for the life she'd lost, for the years spent running. Elijah held her through it, this woman who'd kept herself so carefully controlled finally allowing herself to break. I'm not Evelyn anymore, she whispered when the tears finally stopped. She died that night with Theodore. I don't know how to be her again. Then don't, Elijah said simply. Be Clara. Be my wife. Be whoever you want to be now. She lifted her head from his shoulder, studying his face in the firelight. Do you still want me to be? Your wife, after everything? More than before, he admitted. Before, you were a mystery. Now you're real, broken in places maybe, but real. And that's worth more than perfection. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain for the parched earth. Change was coming. To the land, to their lives, to everything they'd built in these few short weeks. But for tonight, they sat together by the fire, no longer strangers playing at marriage, but two damaged souls who'd found in each other the possibility of redemption. The silence in the house grew oppressive after Elijah told Clara to leave. For 3 days, he moved through his routines mechanically, feeding the horses, checking the cattle, mending what needed mending. But the ranch felt hollow without her presence, like a bell without its clapper. The coffee tasted bitter. The food turned to ash in his mouth. Even the familiar work that had sustained him through Samuel's death now felt meaningless. He found himself standing in the doorway of what had been her room, staring at the neatly made bed, the empty hooks where her few dresses had hung. She'd left nothing behind except the lingering scent of lavender soap and an ache in his chest that grew sharper with each passing hour. Meanwhile, Clara had taken shelter in the abandoned miner's shack on the outskirts of town. The place was barely standing, walls of weathered wood that let in wind and rain, a roof that leaked in 3 places, and a floor of packed dirt, but it was shelter. And more importantly, it was far enough from town that she could avoid the stares and whispers that followed her everywhere. She'd found work at the boarding house, washing linens for Mrs. Henderson, who was one of the few people willing to hire a suspected murderess. The lye soap cracked her hands raw, and her back ached from bending over the wash tubs. But Clara welcomed the physical pain. It distracted from the deeper hurt of Elijah's rejection. "You know, Mrs. Henderson said one morning, watching Clara scrub a particularly stubborn stain, "that Hart boy's been looking poorly. Saw him in town yesterday. Thin as a rail and hollow-eyed." Clara's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their work. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you? Because seems to me 2 people suffering separately when they could be suffering together is a particular kind of foolishness." But Clara said nothing, just bent lower over her work. It was near sunset on the 4th day when trouble found her. 3 men from town, Jack Morrison, Bill Turner's eldest son, and a drifter named Cole, had been drinking at the saloon, working up their courage and their hatred. "Ain't right," Jack slurred to his companions. "Having a murderess walking free among decent folk, if the law won't handle it. Maybe we should." They found her at the shack just as darkness fell. Clara heard them coming. Drunk men aren't quiet, and she reached for the rifle she'd bought with her first wages. But there were 3 of them, and they spread out, approaching from different angles. "Evening, Miss Morrison," Jack called out mockingly. "Or is it Mrs. Hart? Hard to keep track of all your lies." "Leave me be," Clara said steadily, the rifle trained on Jack's chest. "I've no quarrel with you, but we got one with you." Cole snarled, moving closer from the left. "Women like you bring nothing but trouble. Time you moved on." "Or maybe," Bill Jr. suggested from the right, his eyes glittering with something darker than drink. "She needs teaching a lesson about deceiving good men." They rushed her then. All at once, Clara got one shot off, grazing Cole's shoulder, before Jack knocked the rifle from her hands. She fought with the desperate strength of someone who'd survived worse, but 3 against 1 were odds too steep. Bill Jr. grabbed her arms while Jack laughed, reaching for her with grubby hands. The sound of hoofbeats thundering through the darkness made them all freeze. Elijah burst into the clearing like an avenging angel, leaping from his horse before it had fully stopped. The fury in his eyes was something primordial, dangerous. "Get your hands off her!" His voice was deadly quiet. "Now, Hart," Jack started, "this ain't your concern no more." Elijah's fist connected with his jaw before he could finish. Jack went down hard, spitting blood and teeth. Bill Jr. released Clara to face this new threat. But Elijah was already moving, driven by rage and guilt and something fiercer than both. He fought like a man possessed, taking hits without seeming to feel them, dealing out punishment with methodical brutality. Cole, clutching his wounded shoulder, tried to run. Elijah caught him at the edge of the clearing, throwing him bodily into a pile of mining equipment. The crash echoed through the night. When it was over, all 3 men lay groaning in the dirt. Elijah stood over them, breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding. "You come near her again," he said, his voice carrying the promise of death. "And I'll kill you, every last one of you. That's not a threat, it's a guarantee." They scrambled away into the darkness. Cole supported between the other 2, leaving Clara and Elijah alone in the sudden quiet. He turned to her then, and the rage drained from his face, replaced by something raw and desperate. "Are you hurt?" "No," she whispered. "Elijah, Why are you here?" "Because I'm a fool," he said roughly. "Because I sent away the best thing that ever happened to me out of fear and hurt pride. Because these 3 days without you have been hell, and I'd rather face whatever comes together than spend another day in that empty house." Clara swayed on her feet, the adrenaline leaving her shaky. Elijah caught her, pulling her against him, and suddenly they were kissing with all the desperation of the lost and found. His hands tangled in her hair, her fingers clutched at his shirt, and the world narrowed to just this, the heat between them, the need that had been building since the day she stepped off that train. They barely made it into the shack before passion overtook them completely. In the dim lantern light, on the narrow cot that served as her bed, they came together with a fierce tenderness born of almost losing each other. There was nothing gentle about it. It was raw need, mutual hunger, the claiming of two people who'd been alone too long. Afterward, they lay entwined in the narrow space, skin cooling in the desert night. Clara traced the new bruises blooming on Elijah's ribs. "You could have been killed," she murmured. "So could you." He caught her hand, pressing it flat against his chest where his heart still raced. "When Mrs. Henderson told me those fools were talking about teaching someone a lesson, and I realized you were out here alone. I've been alone before, but you don't have to be anymore." He shifted to look at her properly, his gray eyes serious. "Come home, Clara. Come back to the ranch, not as my mail-order bride or my housekeeper, but as my wife. My true wife." Tears slipped silently down her cheeks. "After what I did? After the lies? We've all got our ghosts. You were protecting yourself the only way you knew how." He wiped her tears with his thumb. "But no more running, no more hiding. We face whatever comes next together." Clara studied his face, seeing the truth there. "The hearing is in 3 days. If Judge Matheson rules against me, then I'll sell the ranch and we'll run together. Mexico, California, wherever you want. But I'm betting he won't. Not when he hears the truth. You'd give up everything, your home, your life here. This place ain't home without you in it," he said simply. She kissed him then, soft and deep, sealing the promise. When dawn broke, they returned to the ranch together, Clara wearing Elijah's coat against the morning chill, their horses walking close enough that their legs brushed with each step. The town noticed, of course. By noon, everyone knew that Elijah Hart had brought his controversial bride back home, that he'd beaten 3 men within an inch of their lives for threatening her. Some disapproved, whispering about the corruption of a good man. Others, like Mrs. Henderson and Sheriff Bradley, nodded approval at a man standing by his woman. For the next 2 days, Elijah and Clara prepared for the hearing. They retrieved the buried bundle, carefully drying and preserving what evidence they could. Clara wrote out her statement, every painful detail of Theodore's crimes and her sister's death. Elijah sent telegrams to New York, trying to find anyone who might corroborate her story. At night, they lay together in the bed they now shared as true husband and wife, finding comfort in each other's arms. The physical connection between them had unleashed something deeper, a tenderness that made every touch significant, every glance weighted with meaning. "Are you afraid?" Elijah asked the night before the hearing. "Terrified," Clara admitted, "but not alone. That makes all the difference." He pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair. "Whatever happens tomorrow, remember, you're Clara Hart now, my wife, and I protect what's mine." She turned in his arms, meeting his eyes in the darkness. "And what if protecting me costs you everything? Then I'll count it fair trade," he said without hesitation. "Some things are worth more than land or cattle or what the neighbors think. You taught me that." They made love again then, slow and tender this time, memorizing each other against an uncertain future. Outside, storm clouds gathered, promising rain that would either nourish the earth or wash everything away. But inside their small house, 2 wounded souls had found healing in each other, and that was worth any storm that might come. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, matching the weight in both their hearts. Clara dressed carefully in her best dress, the gray traveling outfit, cleaned and pressed. Elijah wore his Sunday clothes, looking uncomfortable but determined in the starched collar, as they prepared to leave for town and the hearing that would decide their fate. Clara caught his hand. "Elijah, thank you for believing in me, for fighting for me, for loving me despite everything." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing the palm gently. "Thank you for being worth fighting for," he replied. They climbed into the wagon together, facing the uncertain road ahead as they'd learned to face everything, side by side, hearts united, ready for whatever judgment awaited them in town. The ranch fell away behind them, but they carried with them something more valuable than land or safety: the knowledge that they'd chosen each other, completely and irrevocably, and that choice made them stronger than any force that might try to tear them apart. The news of Clara's past spread through Red Hollow like wildfire in dry brush. By the time Elijah and Clara returned from the miner's shack, every household in town knew that their mysterious mail-order bride was wanted for murder back east. The whispers followed them down Main Street like tumbleweeds in a dust storm. "Murderess!" someone hissed from a doorway. "Jezebel!" came another voice. Poor Elijah, taken in by a conniving woman. Clara kept her head high, but Elijah felt her hand tremble where it rested on his arm. He covered it with his own, a silent promise of protection. At the general store, Henry Patterson blocked their entrance. "We don't serve her kind here," he said flatly. "Her kind." Elijah's voice was dangerously quiet. "Killers, liars, women who deceive good men." "Then I guess you won't be serving me either," Elijah said, "because where my wife isn't welcome, neither am I." Patterson's face reddened. "Now see here. Heart. No, you see here." Elijah stepped closer, using his height advantage. "Clara is my wife. Disrespect her. You disrespect me. And I'll remember every slight when it comes time to decide where to buy my supplies or who to sell my cattle to." The threat of lost business made Patterson step aside, though his scowl remained. Inside, the few customers present quickly found reasons to leave. Mrs. Abigail Foster, the banker's wife, made a show of gathering her skirts away from Clara as she passed. Young Tom Bradley, the sheriff's nephew, stared openly until Elijah's glare sent him scurrying. They gathered their supplies in tense silence, Clara selecting only the barest necessities. When Elijah added extra flour and coffee to their order, she touched his arm. "We shouldn't spend—" "We'll need provisions," he said firmly. "This is our home. We're not going anywhere." At the counter, Patterson tallied their goods with obvious reluctance. "That'll be $8.40, he said, the price notably higher than usual. Elijah paid without comment, but his eyes promised retribution for the price gouging. As they loaded the wagon, more townspeople emerged to stare and whisper. Clara maintained her composure until they were out of town, then sagged against him. "Maybe I should leave," she said quietly. "Go somewhere where my past won't destroy your future." "Our future," Elijah corrected. "And the only place you're going is home, with me." But the persecution had only begun. Over the following days, their isolation deepened. The few ranch hands who sometimes helped Elijah with larger jobs sent word they were no longer available. The traveling preacher who'd been expected to hold services refused to come if that woman would be present. Then came the night visits, rocks thrown at windows, dead animals left on their doorstep, threatening notes nailed to fence posts. Elijah took to sleeping with his rifle close and keeping watch in shifts. It was Clara who surprised him with her resilience. Instead of cowering, she seemed to grow stronger with each act of hatred. She repaired the broken windows, cleaned away the dead creatures without complaint, and burned the threatening notes without reading them. "You've dealt with worse," Elijah observed one morning, watching her calmly sweep glass from another broken window. "I have," she agreed, "but I hate that you're suffering for my sins." "They're not sins. You defended yourself. The law might not see it that way. And even if they do," she gestured toward town, This won't stop. The scheduled hearing was postponed when Judge Matheson fell ill, leaving them in limbo. Pinkerton remained in town, his presence a constant reminder of the threat hanging over them. Sheriff Bradley did his best to maintain order, but he was only one man against a town's growing hostility. Father Miguel Rodriguez, the Catholic priest who served the Mexican families in the valley, was one of the few who showed them kindness. He appeared at their door one evening, a basket of food from his parishioners in hand. "God sees the heart," he said simply, "and he knows the difference between justice and murder." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Father. There is a small chapel in the hills," he offered, "if you wish to be married properly, in the eyes of God." Elijah and Clara exchanged glances. They'd been living as man and wife, but their marriage had never been blessed by clergy. "We'd be honored," Elijah said. The ceremony took place at dawn 3 days later, in a tiny adobe chapel with only Father Rodriguez and his elderly housekeeper as witnesses. Clara wore her simple calico dress, wildflowers from the desert in her hair. Elijah had polished his boots and brushed his best jacket until it was almost respectable. "Do you, Elijah, take this woman to be your wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, until death parts you?" Father Rodriguez asked in his soft, accented voice. "I do," Elijah said firmly, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. "Do you, Clara, take this man to be your husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, until death parts you?" "I do," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Then, by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined, let no man tear asunder." They kissed there in the tiny chapel, sunlight streaming through the single window, and for a moment, the outside world ceased to exist, but reality waited for them beyond the chapel walls. On their return to the ranch, they found Sheriff Bradley waiting with grim news. "Judge Matheson passed in the night," he said. "They're sending a replacement from Tucson, but it could be weeks, maybe months." "And until then?" Clara asked. "Pinkerton's pushing for immediate extradition. Says with Matheson dead, there's no reason to delay. I'm holding him off, but—" Bradley shrugged helplessly. That night, a group of masked riders appeared at the ranch. Elijah met them at the door, rifle in hand, Clara behind him with her pistol. "We want the woman," a muffled voice called out. "Send her out and there won't be trouble. The only trouble here is you boys trespassing on my property," Elijah responded. "Turn around and ride out while you still can. There's 12 of us and 2 of you. Hart, don't be a fool." "Maybe so, but I'll drop at least 3 of you before you get to this door. Starting with you, Jim Morrison." "Yeah, I recognize your horse. And that's Bill Turner's saddle. You boys sure you want your wives to be widows over this?" The riders shifted uneasily. Fighting a man defending his home was different from terrorizing an isolated woman. "This ain't over, Hart," the leader finally said. "That woman's presence here is a poison. It'll spread until it destroys everything decent in this town. The only poison I see is hate." Elijah called back, "Now get off my land." They rode away, but both Elijah and Clara knew they'd be back. The town's hatred had reached a boiling point, and something would have to give. The next morning brought unexpected allies. 3 Mexican vaqueros appeared at the ranch, men who'd worked for Elijah in better times and remembered his fairness. Senor Hart, their leader. Miguel Chavez said, "We hear you have trouble. We come to help. I can't pay much." Elijah warned, "We do not come for money. We come because you treated us with respect when others did not. Your senora, she is persecuted for defending herself. We understand this. We help." Their presence allowed Elijah and Clara to rest properly for the first time in days. The vaqueros took turns standing watch, their rifles visible deterrents to any who might approach with ill intent. It was during this brief respite that Clara made a decision. She found Elijah in the barn, tending to a horse's split hoof. "I need to go to Tucson," she said. He looked up sharply. "Clara, not to run, to fight. There must be lawyers there." people who understand Eastern law. If I'm going to face trial, I want to be prepared. We'll go together. No, the ranch needs you, and if I'm seen leaving alone, maybe some of the pressure here will ease. Or they'll chase you down before you get 10 miles. That's why I'll take Miguel with me. He knows the back trails, and he's offered to escort me." Elijah straightened, studying her face. The fragile woman who'd arrived on the train was gone, replaced by someone tempered by fire. How long? A week, maybe 2. Long enough to find legal help. Send more telegrams east. Try to find witnesses. He pulled her close, breathing in her scent. "I don't like it." "I know, but we can't just wait here while the town tears itself apart. We need to take action." They made love that night with desperate intensity, trying to memorize each other against the separation to come. In the morning, Clara left with Miguel, taking the lesser-known trails that wound through the mountains. Elijah watched until they disappeared into the desert's shimmer, then turned back to face the ranch and the town alone. The first night without Clara, the riders returned. This time, they brought torches. "Last chance. Hart," the leader called. "Denounce that woman, cast her out, or lose everything." Elijah's answer was a rifle shot that sent the leader's hat flying. "I made my choice. Now make yours." They charged then, but the vaqueros were ready. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions, and the attackers quickly realized they'd underestimated the opposition. 2 riders fell, wounded but not killed. Elijah had ordered his men to aim low. The rest fled in disorder. Sheriff Bradley arrived at dawn to find Elijah and his men cleaning up the aftermath. "This has to stop," the sheriff said wearily. "I agree." Elijah said, "Question is, are you going to stop it? Or do I have to?" Bradley had no answer. The law was failing, and everyone knew it. The town was splitting apart, neighbor against neighbor, over a woman most had never properly met and a crime that happened thousands of miles away. As the sun rose over the desert, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold, Elijah stood on his porch and wondered if Clara would find the help they needed in Tucson, or if, when she returned, there would be anything left to save. The makeshift courtroom in Red Hollow's town hall buzzed with anticipation. Every bench was filled, with more people standing along the walls and crowding the doorway. Judge Harrison Pike, sent from Tucson to replace the late Judge Matheson, sat behind a simple wooden table, his weathered face giving nothing away. Clara sat beside Elijah at the defendant's table, wearing her gray traveling dress, the same one she'd worn when she first arrived in Red Hollow. Her hands were folded calmly in her lap, but Elijah could feel the tension radiating from her. The lawyer she'd found in Tucson, a young man named William Thornton, shuffled papers nervously. Across from them, Pinkerton sat with the territorial prosecutor, looking confident. "This hearing will determine whether sufficient evidence exists to extradite Mrs. Clara Hart to New York to face charges of murder," Judge Pike announced, his gravelly voice cutting through the whispers. "Mr. Prosecutor, you may begin." The prosecutor, a thin man named Charles Whitman, stood and launched into his case. He painted Clara as a calculating woman who had seduced Theodore Worthington for his money, then killed him when he tried to break off their engagement. Pinkerton was called to testify, presenting the warrant and the supposed evidence from New York. The accused fled the scene. Pinkerton stated, "Changed her name multiple times. These are not the actions of an innocent woman, or they're the actions of a terrified woman with no other choice." Thornton interjected, "You'll have your turn, Counselor." Judge Pike warned. The prosecution presented letters from the Worthington family, painting Theodore as the upstanding gentleman tragically cut down. They showed the engagement announcement from the New York papers, proof of Clara's relationship with the victim. The crowd murmured, some shooting dark looks at Clara. Then it was the defense's turn. "Your Honor," Thornton began, his youth showing in his nervous energy. "We intend to prove that Miss Morrison, now Mrs. Hart, acted in self-defense against a man who had already committed murder and was attempting to assault her." That's a serious accusation against a dead man. Judge Pike noted. Yes, Your Honor, but the dead can be guilty too. Clara was called to testify. She rose gracefully. Placing her hand on the Bible Sheriff Bradley held out. As she swore to tell the truth, her voice was steady, though Elijah saw how white her knuckles were as she gripped the witness chair. Tell us about your sister, Lucy, Thornton prompted gently. Clara's composure cracked slightly. Lucy was sunshine, always laughing, always seeing the good in people. She was only 19 when she died. How did she die? The Worthington family said she fell down the stairs while delivering a message to their home, but I saw her body at the undertaker's. The bruises on her throat, those didn't come from a fall. Objection, Whitman called out. Speculation. I'll allow it. Judge Pike said. Continue. Clara told the whole story. Lucy's warnings about Theodore, her attempts to break the engagement, the confrontation in his study. Her voice remained steady until she reached the moment of the attack. He had his hands around my throat, she said, touching her neck unconsciously. He said he'd do to me what he'd done to Lucy, but slower, make me pay for trying to leave him. And then, his letter opener was on the desk. I grabbed it, tried to warn him off, but he lunged at me again, and... Her voice broke. There was so much blood. I tried to help him, but he was gone within moments. Why didn't you stay and explain to the authorities? Clara's laugh was bitter. The Worthington family owns half of New York's police force. Theodore's brother Jonathan told me that if I didn't disappear, my parents would have accidents too. So I ran. The crowd's mood had shifted. Elijah noticed. Where before there had been hostility, now there was uncertainty. Some of the women, especially, were looking at Clara with new understanding. Do you have any proof of these allegations? Judge Pike asked. Thornton produced the packet Clara had retrieved from her buried bundle. Lucy's letters, water-stained but still readable, describing Theodore's unwanted advances and threats. The judge examined them carefully. These are concerning, but they're not proof of murder or assault. No, Your Honor, Thornton agreed. But this might be... He called his surprise witness, a woman named Margaret O'Brien, who had traveled from Denver at Clara's urgent request. She was middle-aged, plainly dressed, with the bearing of someone who'd seen hard times. Miss O'Brien, Thornton began. How do you know the accused? I was a maid in the Worthington household 5 years ago. Margaret replied, her Irish accent thick with emotion. I knew Miss Morrison and her sister. Why did you leave that employment? Margaret's face darkened. Because Theodore Worthington attacked me in the wine cellar. Would have succeeded too, if the butler hadn't heard me screaming. The courtroom erupted. Judge Pike banged his gavel repeatedly until order was restored. And what happened when you reported this attack? Report it? Margaret laughed bitterly. To who? The Worthingtons paid me $50 to leave quietly and threatened to have me arrested for theft if I ever spoke of it. I needed the money, so I took it and kept silent. Been living with that shame ever since. Why come forward now? Margaret looked directly at Clara. Because when I heard what happened, I knew it were my fault. If I'd been braver, spoken up, maybe Lucy Morrison would still be alive. Maybe this lady wouldn't have had to defend herself. I can't change the past, but I can tell the truth now. The prosecutor tried to discredit Margaret, but she held firm. She produced a letter of employment from the Worthingtons, proving she'd worked there. She named other servants who'd witnessed the aftermath of the attack, though she didn't know if they'd ever come forward. Then Thornton played his final card. Your Honor, we have one more piece of evidence. A telegram from a Dr. James Mitchell in New York. He handed the telegram to the judge, who read it with raised eyebrows before reading aloud. Treated Miss Lucy Morrison for strangulation injuries 2 days before death. Warned to say nothing by Worthington family. Cannot stay silent anymore. Will testify if needed. The courtroom was in chaos. Some called Clara a hero for avenging her sister. Others maintained that vigilante justice was still murder. Judge Pike called a recess to review the evidence. During the break, Clara clung to Elijah's hand. "Whatever happens, thank you for standing by me. Whatever happens, we face it together," he promised. When court reconvened, Judge Pike's expression was grave. This is a complex case. On one hand, we have a woman who admits to killing a man and fleeing the scene. On the other, we have compelling evidence that she acted in self-defense against a dangerous predator who had likely already committed murder. He paused, the weight of judgment visible on his shoulders. "The question before me is not whether Mrs. Hart is guilty or innocent. That's for a jury to decide. The question is whether she should be sent back to New York to face a trial that, given the evidence presented about the Worthington family's influence, seems unlikely to be fair." The crowd held its breath. "It is the judgment of this court that extradition should be denied. While Mrs. Hart must answer for her actions, she deserves a fair trial, which she is unlikely to receive in New York. I am recommending that if the territory of Arizona chooses to try this case, it be done here, where the influence of the Worthington family doesn't reach." The reaction was immediate and mixed. Some cheered, others booed. Clara sagged against Elijah in relief, tears streaming down her face, but Judge Pike wasn't finished. "However, Mrs. Hart will remain under legal supervision until this matter is fully resolved. She may not leave the territory and must report weekly to Sheriff Bradley. Furthermore," he continued, raising his voice over the crowd, "I want to address this community. The vigilante actions taken against Mrs. Hart and her husband are a disgrace to justice. Any further harassment will be met with the full force of the law. Sheriff Bradley, I'm authorizing you to deputize additional men if needed to keep the peace." As people began to file out, arguing among themselves, Pinkerton approached their table. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "The Worthingtons won't accept this. They have long reach and longer memories. Then they'll find we have strong backs and loaded rifles." Elijah replied evenly. Outside the courthouse, the town was divided. Some people approached to offer congratulations and apologies for their earlier behavior. Others glared and muttered about corrupted justice. Father Rodriguez was there, offering a blessing, as were the vaqueros who'd stood by them. But it was the women who surprised Clara most, one by one. They approached, some who had shunned her just days before. Mrs. Henderson pressed her hand. "You did what you had to do, dear." Sarah Turner, whose son had been among Clara's attackers, offered a tearful apology. Even Mrs. Patterson, though she didn't speak, gave a small nod of acknowledgement. That evening, back at the ranch, Clara and Elijah sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in brilliant hues. The immediate danger had passed, but they both knew this was just the beginning. The Worthingtons would seek their own justice. The town, while no longer unified against them, remained divided. And somewhere in the shadows, the past still lurked, waiting for another chance to destroy what they'd built. "I should write to my parents," Clara said quietly. "Let them know I'm alive, that it's safe for them now. Will they come here? I don't know. It's been 5 years. They might have moved on, thinking me dead." She leaned against his shoulder. "Would it bother you, having them here?" "Family's family," Elijah said simply. "We've got room." She turned to look at him. This man who'd risked everything for her. "I love you," she said. "I should have said it before, but—" "I know," he interrupted, pulling her close. "Known it for a while now. Just like you know I love you." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, the first stars appearing in the vast western sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be a trial to face, a community to heal, a life to rebuild. But tonight, they had each other, and the knowledge that sometimes justice comes in unexpected forms. In the distance, a coyote howled, and the desert answered back. Life in the West was never easy, but for those strong enough to face its trials, it offered something precious, the chance to become who you truly were, not who the world expected you to be. And in that wild, unforgiving landscape, two broken souls had found their redemption, not in forgetting the past, but in facing it together. The months following the hearing passed in a strange rhythm of normalcy and vigilance. Elijah and Clara retreated to their ranch, avoiding town except for necessary supply runs and Clara's weekly reports to Sheriff Bradley. The hostility hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had muted to suspicious glances and whispered conversations that died when they approached. Winter came early that year, bringing unusual cold that turned the desert into a crystalline landscape. Ice formed on the water troughs each morning, and the mountains wore caps of snow like elderly judges. Clara had never experienced a western winter, and Elijah found unexpected joy in teaching her how to manage, how to break ice for the animals, how to bank the fires to last through frigid nights, how to read the sky for incoming storms. They worked side by side from dawn to dusk, falling into the rhythm of ranch life. The cattle needed constant attention in the cold, and there were fences to mend, supplies to organize, and preparations for the spring that seemed impossibly distant. The hard work was a blessing. It left little time for dwelling on the sword still hanging over their heads. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire, Clara reading aloud from the few books they owned while Elijah worked leather or mended tack. Sometimes he'd tell her stories about growing up on the ranch with Samuel, and she'd share carefully edited memories of her Philadelphia childhood, the parts that didn't hurt too much to remember. "Do you ever regret answering my advertisement?" Elijah asked one night as snow fell softly outside their window. Clara looked up from her mending, studying his face in the firelight. "How can I regret the thing that saved my life? Not just from the Worthingtons, but from the woman I was becoming, always running, always afraid, always alone. You might have found peace somewhere else, without all this trouble. Peace isn't the absence of trouble, Elijah. It's having someone to face the trouble with." He reached for her then, and she came willingly into his arms. Their lovemaking had evolved from the desperate passion of their early coupling to something deeper, a communion of souls that needed few words. That night, as snow blanketed the desert in temporary innocence, they lost themselves in each other, finding in their joining a completeness that made the outside world fade to insignificance. It was near Christmas when Clara made her announcement. They were having breakfast, the kitchen warm and steamy from the stove, when she suddenly set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. "I'm going to have a baby." Elijah froze, a forkful of eggs halfway to his mouth. You're certain?" "As certain as a woman can be. I've missed my monthly twice now, and there's been sickness in the mornings." She watched his face anxiously. "I know the timing isn't ideal, with the trial still pending in the town." He was around the table before she could finish, pulling her up and into his arms. "Ideal? Clara, this is—" He stopped, overwhelmed. "A baby. Our baby. You're happy?" "Happy?" He laughed, spinning her around before remembering her condition and setting her down gently. I don't have words. Scared?" "Yes, but happy doesn't begin to cover it." They stood there in their small kitchen, holding each other while breakfast grew cold, both thinking of the future that suddenly seemed more precious and more precarious than ever. The news changed everything. Elijah became almost comically protective, trying to prevent Clara from lifting anything heavier than a coffee pot. She tolerated it for about a week before putting her foot down. "I'm having a baby, not dying of consumption," she declared, continuing to haul water despite his protests. Ranch women have been doing this work while pregnant since the first homestead was built, but she did allow him to take over the heavier chores, and she found herself moving more carefully, one hand often resting protectively on her still flat stomach. They decided to keep the news private for now, though Clara suspected Mrs. Henderson had guessed when she caught the older woman giving her knowing looks during their last trip to town. The fewer people who knew, the safer Clara felt. The Worthingtons had been quiet, but neither she nor Elijah believed they'd given up. Winter deepened, bringing a blizzard that isolated the ranch for nearly a week. They spent the storm huddled together, talking about names and making plans for converting the small storage room into a nursery. The enforced closeness only strengthened their bond. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him Samuel," Elijah said one evening. If that's all right with you. Samuel Hart. Clara tested the name. Yes, I like that. And if it's a girl? Lucy, he said without hesitation. For your sister. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She would have loved being an aunt. She was wonderful with children. It was during a brief break in the weather that Miguel Chavez arrived with troubling news. Senor Hart, there are strangers in town. 2 men, well-dressed, asking questions about the senora. Pinkerton's back. No, these are different. Younger, they say they are lawyers from New York. Elijah and Clara exchanged worried glances. Did they say what they want? They speak of civil suits, of recovering damages for the Worthington family. Sheriff Bradley. He tells them they must wait, that there is still the criminal matter to resolve. But they smile and say they have time. After Miguel left, Clara sank into a chair. They won't stop, will they? Even if I'm acquitted here, they'll pursue me through the civil courts. Try to take everything we have. Let them try, Elijah said grimly. This land has been in my family for 30 years. They'll find it's not so easy to take what belongs to folks out here. But privately, he worried. Their resources were limited, and the Worthingtons seemed to have endless money for lawyers and investigators. How long could they hold out against such pressure? The answer came sooner than expected. 3 days later, Sheriff Bradley arrived with an official-looking envelope. Came by special courier, he said, hat in hand. Thought I'd better bring it myself. Clara opened it with steady hands, though Elijah noticed how pale she'd grown. She read silently, then handed it to him. The territorial prosecutor is dropping all charges, she said faintly. It says here that given the evidence presented at the hearing and new testimony that's come to light in New York, they see no purpose in pursuing the matter further. That's good news, isn't it? Sheriff Bradley asked, confused by their subdued reaction. Read the last paragraph, Clara instructed. Elijah found it and read aloud. However, this decision does not preclude civil action by the Worthington family, who maintain their right to seek compensation for their loss through appropriate channels. So it's not over, the sheriff said, understanding. It's never over, Clara replied. They'll hound us through the courts, bleed us dry with legal fees. Make sure we never know peace. That night, lying in bed with Clara curled against him, her hand resting on her belly where their child grew, Elijah made a decision. We could leave, head to California or Oregon, start fresh where they can't find us. No, Clara's voice was firm. I'm done running. This is our home. This is where our child will be born. If the Worthingtons want to fight, they'll get one. It could cost us everything. Then we'll build again, as long as we're together, as long as our baby is safe. Nothing else matters. He pulled her closer, marveling at her strength. The frightened woman who'd stepped off the train months ago had been transformed by adversity into someone formidable. All right, we stay and fight. Over the next weeks, they prepared. Elijah sold some cattle to build a legal fund. Clara wrote to anyone she could think of who might help. Old friends of her family. Sympathetic journalists who might tell their side of the story. Reform advocates who fought against the abuse of power by wealthy families. Some letters went unanswered, but others brought unexpected support. A women's suffrage group in Denver offered to publicize her case. A lawyer in San Francisco wrote to offer advice on fighting civil suits. Most surprisingly, Margaret O'Brien sent word that she'd convinced 2 other former Worthington servants to come forward about Theodore's behavior. Spring arrived with its usual promise of renewal. The desert bloomed with unexpected color, purple lupins, golden poppies, the delicate white flowers of the saguaro cactus. Clara's pregnancy began to show, a gentle rounding that filled Elijah with wonder and terror in equal measure. It was on a particularly beautiful morning, with birds singing and the air sweet with wildflower scent, that their hard-won peace shattered. Elijah was in the barn when he heard Clara scream. He ran to the house to find her standing in the kitchen, staring at a letter that had been slipped under the door. "What is it?" he demanded, taking the paper from her trembling hands. The message was brief and chilling. "Your husband for your debt. Choose wisely. You have 3 days. It's Jonathan, Clara whispered. Theodore's brother. He's here. You can't know that. I know his hand. I know his mind. She sank into a chair, both hands protective over her belly. He blames me for Theodore's death. This isn't about money. It's about revenge. Then we go to the sheriff. With what? An unsigned note? Jonathan's too clever to give us anything we could use legally. She looked up at him, eyes haunted. He means it. Elijah, he'll try to kill you to punish me. I'm not easy to kill. Neither was Theodore. They spent the rest of the day in tense preparation. Elijah cleaned and loaded every weapon they owned. Clara packed emergency supplies in case they needed to flee quickly, but both knew they were preparing for a confrontation that legal authorities couldn't prevent. That night, as they lay wakeful in the darkness, Clara spoke into the silence. I have to meet with him. Absolutely not. Elijah, no, you're not putting yourself and our baby in danger. We'll handle this another way. But as she pressed against him, feeling their child move for the first time, a flutter like butterfly wings, Clara knew there was only one way this could end. The past had come calling, and this time, she couldn't run. This time, she had too much to lose. The desert wind howled outside, and somewhere in the darkness, Jonathan Worthington waited with the patience of a predator. 3 days. The note had said, 3 days to find a solution, or lose everything they'd fought to build. Clara closed her eyes and prayed. To the God of Father Rodriguez's chapel, to the spirits of the desert, to her sister's memory. She prayed for wisdom, for strength, and most of all, for a way to protect the 2 people who had become her entire world, the man who'd saved her soul, and the child who represented their future. Spring transformed the desert into a tapestry of life. The harsh browns and grays of winter gave way to unexpected splashes of color, the brilliant yellow of Palo Verde trees in bloom, the deep purple of desert lupines, and the delicate pink of fairy duster flowers. It was as if the land itself was celebrating new beginnings. Clara stood at the window of their small ranch house, one hand resting on her swelling belly, where their child grew stronger each day. The morning sickness had passed, replaced by an energy that surprised her. She felt more alive than she had in years, as if carrying this new life had awakened something dormant within her. Elijah found her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his hands covering hers on her belly. How are my 2 favorite people this morning? Restless, Clara admitted. The baby's been dancing all night. Takes after its mother, he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Always moving, always thinking. They'd settled into a routine of careful normalcy after Jonathan Worthington's threat had passed, or rather, after Sheriff Bradley had run him out of town with a warning about threatening pregnant women. But both knew it was merely a reprieve. The Worthingtons didn't give up easily. Young Tom Henderson had started working the ranch part-time, helping Elijah with the heavier work as Clara's pregnancy advanced. The boy was eager and quick to learn, and his mother's newfound support of Clara had extended to allowing her son to work for them. Mrs. Hart, Tom called from the barn one morning. You might want to see this. Clara made her way carefully across the yard, finding Tom standing over their milk cow with a puzzled expression. Beside the cow, wobbling on unsteady legs, was a newborn calf. Well, I'll be. Clara laughed, delighted. Bessie, you sly thing. We didn't even know you were expecting. Guess it's the season for it, Tom said, grinning as he glanced at Clara's obvious condition. As Clara helped tend to the new calf, she felt a deep contentment settle over her. This was what she'd dreamed of in those long years of running. A simple life, honest work, the cycle of seasons and birth and growth, the fact that she'd found it in this unlikely place, with an unlikely man, only made it more precious. The first letter from her parents arrived on a cloudless Tuesday. Clara's hands shook as she recognized her mother's careful script. She'd written to them months ago, after the hearing, but hadn't dared hope for a response. My dearest Clara, the letter began. Your father and I wept with joy to learn you are alive and safe. We never believed what they said about you. Lucy visits me in dreams sometimes, and she always tells me you did right." Clara had to stop reading, tears blurring her vision. Elijah held her as she sobbed. For her lost sister, for the years of separation, for parents who'd never stopped believing in her innocence. The letter went on to say they were too old and settled to make the journey west, but they sent their blessing on her marriage and their joy about the coming grandchild. Her mother had enclosed a small lace christening gown, the same one Clara and Lucy had worn as babies. "Family," Clara whispered, clutching the tiny gown. "I thought I'd lost them forever." "Family has a way of finding its way back," Elijah said, thinking of his own losses and gains. As Clara's time drew nearer, the women of Red Hollow surprised them both. Where once there had been suspicion and hostility, now came unexpected kindness. Mrs. Patterson appeared one day with a hand-sewn quilt. Sarah Turner brought preserves and advice about childbirth. Even the Mexican women from the valley, who had always been kind, increased their visits, bringing herbs and remedies passed down through generations. Babies change things. Mrs. Henderson explained during one visit, watching Clara arrange tiny clothes in the wooden cradle Elijah had built. Makes people remember what's really important. The transformation of the town's attitude wasn't complete. There were still those who crossed the street rather than greet them, but it was enough to make Clara feel less isolated as her time approached. It was high summer when Clara woke to the first pains. The desert shimmer was already rising from the ground, promising another scorching day. But Clara barely noticed the heat. She gripped Elijah's hand as another wave of pain rolled through her. "It's time," she gasped. "The baby's coming." Elijah had prepared for this moment, but faced with the reality, he felt panic rise. "I'll get Mrs. Henderson and the midwife from the Mexican settlement. Don't do anything until I get back." Clara might have laughed if she wasn't focused on breathing through the pain. "I don't think the baby's going to wait for permission, my love." The next hours blurred together, the arrival of Mrs. Henderson and Senora Martinez, the ancient midwife who delivered half the babies in the valley. The pain that came in waves, each stronger than the last. Elijah's hand in hers, his voice steady even though she could see the fear in his eyes. "You're the strongest woman I know," he whispered during a brief respite. "You've survived worse than this." "This is different," Clara panted. "This is for something good, for our future." As the sun reached its zenith, painting the desert in shades of gold and rust, Samuel Elijah Hart entered the world with a cry that announced his displeasure at leaving his comfortable home. He was perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, a shock of dark hair, and his father's gray eyes. Clara held him for the first time with a sense of awe that bordered on disbelief. This tiny person, this miracle, had grown beneath her heart through all the trials and tribulations. He was proof that life could triumph over death, that love could grow in the most unlikely soil. "He's beautiful," Elijah whispered, one finger gently stroking his son's cheek, just like his mother. "He has your stubborn chin," Clara countered, smiling through tears of joy and exhaustion. As word spread through the valley, visitors came to pay their respects. Father Rodriguez blessed the baby, speaking words in Latin and Spanish that sounded like ancient protection. The vaqueros who'd stood by them brought a tiny silver cross. Even Sheriff Bradley stopped by, hat in hand, to offer congratulations. It was Tom Henderson who brought the news that changed everything. He arrived breathless one evening, having ridden hard from town. "Mr. Hart, there's news from back east, that Worthington family. Something's happened." Clara, nursing Samuel in the rocking chair Elijah had made, felt her heart freeze. "What kind of something?" "Jonathan Worthington's been arrested. For murder. Killed a woman in Boston. And this time there were witnesses. Lots of them. The whole family's in disgrace. Their money's tied up in legal battles. Papers say they won't be bothering anyone out here anymore." Clara closed her eyes, feeling a weight she'd carried for so long finally lift. It was over. Truly, finally over. The shadow that had haunted her for 5 years had lifted, not through violence or revenge, but through Jonathan's own evil nature catching up with him. That night, as Samuel slept peacefully in his cradle, Clara and Elijah stood on their porch watching the stars wheel overhead. The desert stretched endlessly before them, no longer a place of exile, but a canvas for their future. "We could go anywhere now," Elijah said quietly. "Back east to see your parents, California, anywhere you want." Clara leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of him, the safety she'd found in his arms. "I'm already where I want to be. This is our home, where our son was born, where we became a family. No regrets. How could I regret the path that led me to you? To this?" She gestured to the land, the house, the life they'd built from dust and determination. In the weeks that followed, they established new rhythms. Clara learned to manage ranch work with a baby on her hip. Elijah discovered he could calm Samuel's cries by humming the old cowboy songs his mother had sung to him. The ranch prospered. The town fully accepted them, and life took on the sweet ordinariness that Clara had once thought beyond her reach. One evening, as autumn began to paint the mountains in shades of copper and gold, Clara found the bundle she'd buried so long ago. The letters were faded, the blood-stained dress just cloth now, its power to hurt diminished by time and happiness. She and Elijah built a fire outside, and together they fed the past to the flames. "No more running," Clara said, watching the smoke rise into the star-filled sky. "No more hiding, no more secrets." Elijah agreed, pulling her close. Samuel gurgled from his basket nearby, and Clara lifted him into her arms, here, under the vast western sky. 3 souls had found each other against all odds. A lonely cowboy, a desperate woman fleeing injustice, and the child who represented their hope for the future. The desert wind whispered through the mesquite, carrying away the ashes of old pain. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and somewhere an owl hunted in the darkness. Life and death, joy and sorrow, love and loss, all part of the eternal dance of existence. But in this moment, in this place, there was only peace. Clara looked at her husband, their son, their modest but beloved home, and knew that sometimes the longest journeys led not to grand destinations, but to the simple truth that home is where love lives. "What are you thinking?" Elijah asked, noting her contemplative mood. "That every broken road led here," Clara said softly, "and I'm grateful for every step, every stumble, every moment of despair, because they all led me to you." He kissed her then, under the stars that had witnessed their journey from strangers to soulmates. Samuel cooed contentedly between them, and the ranch settled into peaceful slumber around them. The mail-order bride who'd arrived with secrets and sorrow had become a wife, a mother, a respected member of the community. The cowboy who had lost his brother had found a family, and in the harsh beauty of the western frontier, they'd written a story of redemption that proved love could indeed conquer all, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through the daily choice to stand together, to forgive, to hope, and to build something lasting from the ashes of the past. As Clara had once said, she wasn't most women, and this wasn't most love stories. It was theirs, written in desert dust and starlight, sealed with tears and joy, and promised to continue as long as the sun rose over the mountains and set behind the endless horizon of possibility. The beginning. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Clara and Elijah's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening to this tale. Please leave a comment below and let me know. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more stories of love, redemption, and adventure in the American frontier. Share your thoughts about Clara and Elijah's story in the comments. What part moved you the most? Until next time, partners.